All right, folks, let's do this. Heck yeah. My nemesis went somewhere else. Okay, let's talk about books. This is the final section of the books I read in June, and by splitting a month into 3 videos, I was hoping to have 30-minute videos. Not hoping very hard, not hard enough to, set up a timer, but I thought it might happen on its own. As we know, as I've realized, as seems to be the case, whenever I start recording, I just talk for an hour, regardless of anything. The summer heat lessens the amount of time that I can talk without needing to pause and turn the air conditioner on for a little bit. So I have been doing this, pausing in between. Final section right now. This surprisingly phenomenal book and these DNFs. I'm going to start with this one. I'm going to be disciplined because I want to give you the content of this book. I want to tell you what it says on the inside, which is not always what I want to do. And I would say I want to set it up as a contrast to some of the ineffective things in these books that did not work for me. This one only became the final completed book randomly, but I think this is going to work. This is called Jane Austen's Bookshelf. If you're already rolling your eyes or cringing, that's okay. It's by Rebecca Romney, and it is a piece of nonfiction. The subtitle is A Rare Book Collector's Quest to Find the Women Writers Who Shaped a Legend. I can't remember where I heard about this for the first time, but it was enough that it made me screenshot it or do something to record it. Usually I collect recommendations like impressions, and the more times a book appears in my world, the higher it goes on my mental TBR, and I don't really have any other TBR, and then eventually I will buy and read the book. I said that really fast because it's kind of embarrassing to me that I buy books before I read them so much of the time. But let's just say that's because I work at a bookstore. Yeah, but people can buy, you budget how you want. Just give money away, but also, this is the thing why am I? So, I love that I was like, I'm gonna speed through this thing, and then I just slowed down and camped out there and cringed for a minute. So, I saw this book. Then, I wasn't super sold on it because I was like, Jane Austen, like, kind of eye roll, kind of basic. I like Pride and Prejudice especially, and yet I'm a little contrarian. Then it was up for a Goodreads Choice Award. I think I voted for it even though I hadn't read it yet. Then I was in Maine in October with Teddy at Print. I think I have the bookmark from there here. And I thought about catching those. Yes. We good, babe? There we go. This Print, a bookstore, Portland, Maine. And the owner person was so nice, and thrillingly, the book was $6 for a hardcover, which is usually $30 or $32 right now, because of this little tear, which, again, different damages bother different people. That could not bother me less. So then I bought it because it was so cheap, which otherwise maybe it would have been lost to me forever, to quote Rebel. And then it sat on my shelf, my TBR, my physical TBR, the final stop for a really long time, like 6 months, more than that, because it's June. What happened? Well, I was looking at my TBR and I thought, well, you need to finally read. The nonfiction TBR moves a little slower than fiction, and I thought if you're gonna read it, you gotta read it. And if you're not gonna read it, find out and then DNF it and then move on. So I guessed that I was gonna do a syllabus read. I started the introduction. It's a little corny light. She kind of makes a lot of Sherlock Watson references in terms of searching for different books. But I settled in, and then I was in. I was so locked in. So the premise of this book, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk about this. This book does so much more than you can explain in a video. It does so much more than I expected that it was going to do. And every chapter built an argument, discovered research, discovered old books from the 1800s with a single line that found the one moment that this woman writer fell out of favor, all that kind of thing. And it was really cool to read. The woman who wrote it, Rebecca Romney, is the absolute best person to write it because of her expertise as a rare book collector. And that was one of the things that made it so cool, because like we're so used to having access to all of the classics because they're on the internet, but until recently that wasn't the case. So she knows how to find books on the market, and then not just the original copies of, there's 8 or so chapters in here, and each of them are about a different female writer who Jane Austen did or probably did read. She then doesn't only find their books, she traces from the years their book were published all the way to the present day, the different times their books were talked about in other books. Meaning that if you get, say the book came out in, wait a moment, yeah, 1804. I was like, which century? Then, maybe it's more damaged than just the little tear. Then your book would be in print for a while. If it did really well, it would get more editions. And then 20 years later, if people keep wanting it and it gets put in the canon, if it gets positively reviewed and put in overviews of the novel in English, for example, like the novel was a new form at this time. And so in 1830, someone's going to write a retrospective on the invention of the novel. And if they included Anne Radcliffe, for example, or Elizabeth Inchbald, then it was more likely that that author's books would receive a reprint, and then that would make a whole other generation able to read their books, and then that would mean the scholar who grew up during that generation and then wrote the next generation's little, these are the books that matter, write-up, would include that author's stuff or not. And what's crazy about that is she's so good at it that she traces to individual sentences when a specific female writer fell out of the canon, because most of these women were considered masters of their genre in their lifetime. Like there's one where it was like Shakespeare, Milton, and Anne Radcliffe, I think was that one. There were multiple of these women who were considered to be the best at what they did of anyone. And then one reviewer, one writer would say one thing that shifted the perspective, and she tells you specifically what that is for every single writer, and it's something different for every single one, and it's so cool. Well, maybe I don't need to tell you about every single one. I was just so impressed with this book. So we've got my little Jane Austens back here. My first Jane Austen, I think this is right, that I ever read was Sense and Sensibility. This, in honor of our Rebecca Romney, who can, in the back, I'm just going to say who printed this. Headline review. What I was going to say is, she knows how to describe books because that's part of her job. And in the back, as she's assembled, so she assembled this as a collection. Like she's acquiring books by these writers from 200 years ago or whatever. And she taught me so much about, I have so much to say. Finish that sentence first. She taught me so much about how fun it is to not just to find the version of a book that you want. And that might not be the first edition. And then she connects that to the way that Jane Austen is praised as being the first and the best. And she's like, actually Jane Austen can be great and not have been the first at all, because she actually wasn't. And also, that's not important if that's not what you're going to value. Like, something being the first is not the only thing that makes something interesting. So there's a couple editions, like her edition of Pride and Prejudice that she collects is a later edition, but it has a specific binding that's interesting and legendary. Or one of her paperbacks of one of the, I don't remember who, is the one that was reprinted in the 80s, and it was the first time the book was available to the public in like 190 years or something. So even though it's just like a crummy kind of paperback looking thing, and it wasn't $3 million, it's really valuable and important. And then in this appendix, she lists every book that she's collected, most of which you've read about and read quotes from, and then she does her cool little rare book thing, and she's like, Mothers of the Novel Series, original white pictorial wrappers with design and illustration by Marion Daly, 294 pages. Distributor sticker to rear wrapper, some foxing and soil to wrappers, spine creases, leaves toned. Like, all of these words that mean things. It was so cool. Then I started thinking about my books and collections, and so I pulled my, okay, we're gonna come back to this book when I do my bookshelf tour. That's what we're gonna do. Because right now I'm gonna be like, this is, you know, whatever. Like, if you buy a hardcover book that's new, it's probably first edition, but I didn't know that you can like flip to the copyright page and it will say first edition, or it won't. Like, one of my hardcovers over there, I checked, it said third printing. And like, that's even more interesting to me now because of this. Okay, after I read Sense and Sensibility, I read Emma. And this is kind of, I don't want to be like, this is one of the two you would want to read, this one or Pride and Prejudice, if you're not planning to read a bunch of Jane Austen novels. And there's a lot more about that in this book, which is why I cut myself off. I read this when it was way too hard. And I read the whole thing and it took me a long time. I started noting my vocabulary that I was looking up. I only made it to page 3 before I like just had to start getting the definition from context because that was going to slow me down too much. So anyway, I have read Emma, but I should reread it because it would actually make sense to me now. And then, come on, babe. I didn't read Pride and Prejudice until college, and I thought it was great. And I read it in my Brit Lit class with my smartest classmates and professors, and I forever feel so lucky to have been an English major. And so I thought this one was great. And then one of my professors, I think it was Stephen Epley, Dr. Stephen Epley, mentioned offhand something about Frances Burney when I was in school. He wrote a book about Susanna Rowson, who was the great American female novelist of like the 1700s, so early America. And almost no one knows who she is anymore, but she got mentioned in this book, and I was like, Epley wrote a book about her. And so proud of him for that, love him for that. So then, this is the last book I need from back here. He mentioned that, and I think it was him, that Evelina was the first novel in English, published in English, that was written by a woman. And so I put it on my TBR, and then I got it for Christmas maybe from my parents one time, and I kept just having it on my shelf. And then as I was reading more and more, needing more room on my shelf, I took off the books that I would maybe had shelved in genre but hadn't read. And then I decided to actually read it, and I really thought it was great. Like, I was surprised how propulsive I found it. I would like stay up late reading about it, and Frances Burney is the first author that she covers in here apart from Jane Austen. And okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to flip through. I'm going to edit this down so that I can take my time to think and find things. Focus. I'm going to give you 1 to 3 sentences about each female author. And then you're going to go read this book if you think it sounds interesting. I'm not gonna do the whole setup because I already said, oh, okay. Okay, the other thing that makes something, guys, if I have anything else to say at the end, I can say it at the end. Jane Austen published 4 novels in her lifetime. She died young at 41, I think, and she was praised and still is praised for her realism in her novels. They really resemble everyday life. There's not huge things happening like geopolitical moments. This is a strength, and it was seen in her own time period many critics and readers felt that high art should achieve something more than what one experiences in ordinary life. So there was a chance that we would lose Jane Austen's books because the people in her time thought they were good and they were entertaining, but they weren't fitting the qualifications of what at that time was deemed to be great literature. That was 2 sentences. My final sentence is, after her death, her nephew published a novel called like Memoirs of Aunt Jane, not really, but something like that, and a memoir of Jane Austen. And it released some documents and it had his memories of her, and that was one of the things that refreshed interest in her. And it also described her according to ways that women were now I'm past 3 sentences. Acceptable at the time, and so he emphasized how sweet she was, which maybe was a simplification of Jane Austen's personality, but nevertheless helped her to be seen as good. Frances Burney is the author of Evelina and other books. Her section focuses on 2 things. Number 1, the perception of novels at the time was that they would ruin young women's minds, and therefore female writers of novels were not just getting to write, they had to contend with the idea that they were ruining society and misleading the youth, even though they knew that not to be true. Really interesting. I'm going to give you one quote on that section, read the whole thing, but there's a moralizing male writer named James Fordyce. He stated that the only kind of woman who would read any of the racier novels available at the time must in her soul be a prostitute. Let her reputation in life be what it will. The second thing I'm going to tell you about Frances Burney is that her books had a tinge more fear in her heroine, specifically Evelina. So Evelina gets in a situation where she's like not safe with this man, which is not something that happens in any of Jane Austen's novels. And there's something really interesting and powerful about seeing that experience displayed in really old books. That was quick, that was brief. And I have this whole page marked, so go me. 2 things about Radcliffe. She was a Gothic writer who wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho. I don't know how to say that. And she fell out of the canon because Gothic novels were considered so much less. They were lesser. They were not serious literary work. And because she was intensely private. And so someone tried to write a biography of her in the 1880s, but couldn't find enough material. So that's why Jane Austen stayed, because her nephew had material, and this fan of Anne Radcliffe didn't have material. And if she had been able to publish a biography, there's a chance that a whole new generation would have been interested in her books. That was speedy. This is taking too long, though. I'm gonna do one more. She does include Hannah More, who was a really moralizing writer. She is not able to even get through Hannah More's novel because it's called Celebs Once a Wife or something. Celebs. It's spelled Celebs. Celebs in Search of a Wife. I knew it was weird. And she has a great section on why moralizing writing can be... Okay, anyway, Hannah More. I'm gonna talk about Charlotte Smith. Charlotte Smith gets married to a man who gambles and mistreats her and loses their money. She is constantly pregnant. She finds out that she can sell her writing, and so she writes novels. And she preferred to write, I think this is her, she preferred to write poetry, but poetry even then, interesting, did not sell as much as novels. And so she writes these novels, and in them she begins to put stories that push against the idea of coverture, which is the fact that a married woman was legally, all of her property belonged to her husband, and that really ruined Charlotte Smith's life. And so in her novels, which she's having to write because she doesn't have financial stability from her husband who's keeping money from her and her kids, she protests against that. And also, that was the end of that sentence. I knew about coverture because of the Evie Dunmore series that I think is great, and they are writing to try and get the Married Women's Property Act amended in these books, which are fiction. And the story of Charlotte Smith in this was great. Those who denigrate courtship novels, which is the predecessor of the modern day romance and also what you would call a Jane Austen novel. Those who denigrate courtship novels rarely consider these plots with the law of coverture in mind. When a man has that much control over your life and your children's lives, the kind of man you marry can literally be a question of life or death. The history of English courtship novels is a literary history of women's protest against female coverture. So this was so good, and I have to stop, but you should not stop. You should read it, or at least, if you love plays, you should read the Inchbald chapter. If you love Italian women, this woman marries an Italian man and loses the respect of all of her friends, basically, and you just kind of love her. There's women in here. Frances Burney is one of them, and then Charlotte Lennox, I think, who knew Samuel Johnson. He's the one who's most famous right now for his dictionary, but he was one of the most famous men of letters of his day. And Romney explores how, look, I've made a hole, how being associated with Samuel Johnson could be helpful because he was pretty respectful towards women, and also how over the course of history it could hurt your career as a female writer because later critics would attribute your best work to Samuel Johnson, which she gets into in it. It goes crazy. How long was that? "27 minutes. Okay. I'm waiting for Megan to get home, but that's not her. The dog is quiet, the tank is clean, and we're gonna wrap up June. We're gonna do it fast because that's okay. Books ought to be not too long, and my complaint with Jade City was that it was too long. I expected that going in because I think fantasy books are frequently much too long. Even the early Naomi Novik that I like was a little too wordy. Then she improved and wrote the magical Deadly Education series. This book is, I don't really notice tropes as, okay, no, I'm going too long. This is set in a city in a Asian island nation who has Jade, and Jade makes you magically powerful, and there's two warring clans. Unfortunately, Fonda Lee decides to have you follow the Warring clan, who has been in power for a really long time and whose leader is doing absolutely nothing interesting. It took me a long time to realize this, but one night, 200 pages in, I was lying in bed, and I thought, nothing has happened. Nothing had happened. I'm going to tell you 3 things that did, so if you're going to read this, fast forward, but this is so little, it's not even a spoiler. There was a pretend kidnapping, a duel, and attempted assassination. What happened was the author decides to follow multiple different characters, and then it makes it feel like there's stuff happening, but there's not. So it didn't work for me. Also, she gives you one chapter where you get to see the female leader of the other clan, and she's like super interesting. And then you have to go back to the boring side, and you're like, I don't want this. I don't want to be here. The next book I DNF'd was A Year of Marvelous Ways by Sarah Winman. This one just came out a week or two ago. It was so average, and that's why I stopped reading it. Sometimes a 3-star book is, I think I gave it 3 because I was trying to be, I don't know. If a book is average, I can tell it's gonna be average, and I want to read Heart the Lover, I'm gonna DNF it. It was pretty, there were just enough things about it that didn't really work, and so I didn't read it. It's set post World War I or II. The main character is a soldier from that, and also the main character is a woman named Marvelous Ways who like lives on a creek, and you kind of get her life story a little bit, but it just didn't work for me. The next book I read was Little Wild by Laura Evans, and I DNF'd this one mostly for, well, it was slow, but the structural issues. So every chapter is titled with a time, counting down until a certain time of the day when this person's gonna arrive. So it's, I think, British, and there's like a manor house, and the girl who lives in like, you know, the kind of cottage way down property is friends with the rich girl who lives at the manor house. That's the girl who we're waiting to arrive, and the poor girl is kind of helping around with the cottage or something. It set it up as though it were counting down to Joan's arrival, but the actual content of most of the chapters that said like 11:15 a.m. or whatever were throwbacks and like filling you in on what happened in the past. So it actually wasn't successfully like time stamping you and fulfilling the promise that that structure set up. Also, she did the thing where you could read the last sentence of one chapter and the first sentence of the next chapter, and it's a perfect continuation, which means there shouldn't be a chapter break there. A chapter break needs to transition the reader into a completely different situation, or it needs to exist for some other reason, like a cliffhanger. So those two things were annoying, and it was annoying to be annoyed about waiting when you're supposed to be waiting. So that meant that that wasn't effective, I thought. I could tell I was in the hands of a newbie, and that's not where I wanted to be. It also was supposed to be spooky and magical. It got compared to Wayward, which I liked a decent amount. And then I read people's negative reviews, and I felt so validated that I had not continued to read it. Apparently it didn't, the things they said, I was like, oh, cool. Which I think is a good argument for quitting books. I'm a big believer in quitting books if you aren't going to like them. Okay. The next one that I DNF'd is absolutely so surprising to me, to all the people. It is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. I have been so excited about this book for a really long time, and it's a really important book. It wrote about and researched, Isabel Wilkerson is the author. She researched the Great Migration, which is 6 million people, black people, moving from the South to the North and the West from the 1930s to the 1970s. And it was a massive shift in our country, and it had not been researched very much at all, definitely not this comprehensively for a general audience history book, until this book came out in 2010. Okay, so the thing that it did not do was, sorry, she interviewed, I think, 1,200 something people for this, and then narrowed down from those interviews to 3 people who she interviewed at great length to be the 3 people we follow in this story. I assume what she did was she picked them for a variety of reasons, but central among them, 3 different representations of what an experience of the Great Migration could look like. So one left in the 30s of her 3 main characters, one left in the 40s, and one left in the 50s, one went to California, one went to Chicago, and one went somewhere else, this kind of thing. And so far so good. She did also tons of really incredible research from secondary sources or from primary sources that are not the people that she's interviewing. And those parts were my favorite, where she would settle in and give you overview of, for example, her write-up of Reconstruction was pretty strong. So she's explaining why after the Civil War, then the federal government came in and enforced fairness, and then they left in the 1870s, and then from there until the 19 teens and 20s, Black folk were losing privileges that they had just like a generation before. If you look at the numbers of Black people who were in Congress, for example, it was higher in 1880 than it was the 70s and 80s than it was until like 2 years ago, kind of thing. So yes, Reconstruction falling apart led to Jim Crow laws, which led to the Great Migration. So the way, she has a really great line in here about, the people did not cross the turnstiles of customs at Ellis Island. They were already citizens, but where they came from, they were not treated as such. Their every step was controlled by the meticulous laws of Jim Crow, a 19th century minstrel figure that would become shorthand for the violently enforced codes of the Southern caste system. It persisted from the 1880s to the 1960s, some 80 years, the average lifespan of a fairly healthy man. I was happy with the things that I learned from different parts in here. The reason that I DNF'd it is because she, after narrowing down all of her interviews to such a small number, she doesn't keep exercising the powers of selection to the degree that I think she needed to for this book to be its strongest. I'm going to read from my review for this part. Heartbroken to report that this had too many words. It was most notable on the page level in a way that reminded me of B.K. Borison. Stories and conversations that could have been a paragraph were instead multiple pages. And to that makes something pretty unreadable for me, especially when it's 600 and something pages. She narrowed her pool of interviews down to from 1,200 down to 3, but then she gives you a near live retelling of the stories these people told her. So there's a moment where she's telling you what life was like for one of her characters in Florida, and instead of saying he moved around a lot, when he landed with his father, he had some good friends, they got into trouble stealing and trying to find, they got into some trouble stealing, but he was a hard worker, and so he was able to graduate top of his class and go to college for a year. Say it 3 times that long, get some beautiful sentences or interesting details in there. Instead, she explained every different thing that they stole, the reason why they stole it, the method that they used to steal it, and then she inserted dialogue into the story so that you were watching it as it happened. And you don't need that. So I said, exercising powers of selection are important because they create a sense of focus for the reader and the author. And that's the thing, like when you tighten up the details that you choose, then the details that you leave in become so much more powerful, and it's easier to keep the reader's attention, and the themes that you're developing are physically closer to each other on the page. So like, if you tell how to steal a melon by kicking it across the floor versus how to steal bologna by eating the slices while she goes into the back, whereas if you talk about the reason that you steal as a 12-year-old and the way the store manager treated you, and then you talk about having to go to college and then leave college, then the themes of the way that the structure of the South is working against your likelihood of success is so much more contained, and it's so much more palpable, and it's so much more powerful. So then when that kept happening, I was sad, and then I tried to skim, because I'll do that sometimes with a book that I still really want to read, but it was pretty unskimmable because it was so much just one story after another. And so I DNF'd it. Those are the books. Those are the books. I was reminded of Wright Thompson's The Barn while I was reading The Warmth of Other Suns, in terms of writing about the South and the history of the South in a way that is really really powerful writing, in addition to balancing personal relationships with people who were involved in the history and massive amounts of ancillary research. So this book was so well done. And I thought about some of these paragraphs while I was reading these, because of how compressed and thus more impactful the writing in this one is. Also, Clint Smith is a really strong writer about this type of thing, and well, we could go on for a long time, so we will not. Thank you for watching the video. I don't think I have anything else to say. Okay, bye.